Off. It's bang on 8. So great to see everyone and welcome. It's good to see you all here, another monthly session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I just thought I'd say a few words before we start this evening's session. I know there was quite a few of you came along to the Nature Conservation Council business breakfast last Thursday in Sydney. And that was the third time that the NCC have done that business breakfast. And it was fantastic. I mean, it was basically sold out. There was a room full of 200 people there. And, you know, the title of the event was Towards a Bolder Climate Future. And we had a panel, and the panel was really, really inspiring. I know, as I said, there's a few that are on this call now came along. And it was just a fabulous event. And I think a lot of people went away really sort of enthused and engaged and I suppose motivated to keep on going. And there were 4 independent federal MPs. So we had Zali Steggall, OAM, we had Dr. Sophie Scamps, Kylie Tink and Allegra Spender. And it was facilitated by Jackie Mumford, who's the CEO of the NCC. And I think, you know, it's interesting, that's probably the event that we have had the most feedback on in terms of emails, texts, calls, all that kind of stuff, and lots of comments on LinkedIn. And I think what for a lot of people came through, and certainly for Carolyn and myself, was, first of all, it was just so refreshing to hear from a group of politicians who are motivated by solutions to the climate crisis as opposed to sort of scoring political points on each other. They were really articulate and engaging and a real depth of knowledge to their answers. David, you got a couple of mentions from Sophie, by the way. So that was, and I think in summary, you know, I think everybody felt that, you know, with the independents, we're in very good hands. And I think everybody who attended agreed that basically we need many more of them at the next election in the Parliament. It was really as simple as that. So really, yeah, it was a fabulous event, it really was. Okay, so tonight we're going to hear from Professor David Lindenmayer, AOFAA, and we've titled tonight's session Forest and Climate, and I'm sure it'll be a really fabulous session. So the format, we're going to hear from David in a minute, then we'll ask him some questions and then throw it over to the group, as we always do, for any questions that you would have. So just introducing Professor David Lindenmayer. David is an Australian scientist and academic. He's a distinguished professor of ecology and conservation biology at the Australian National University's Fenner School of Environment and Society. He's one of the world's most highly cited forest ecologists and conservation biologists. He's published more than 900 peer-reviewed scientific papers and 48 books. You're prolific, David. He is a world authority on forestry, woodlands, wildlife and biodiversity conservation. And his research focuses on the adoption of nature, conservation practices in agricultural production areas, developing ways to improve integration of native forest harvesting and biodiversity conservation. And he specialises in large-scale, long-term research monitoring programs, primarily in forests, reserves, national parks, plantations, and on farmland. And he's also recently written a book called The Forest Wars. And we discussed sort of calling this session Forest and Climate. So, David, over to you. And David's not 100%, so it's really appreciated that you've made the effort to join us today. I know you've got all your medications there, but over to you, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen and Carolyn, and thanks everyone for being online. I'm going to work through a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share the screen, and so I just need to make sure that it's working. So, can you just check with that to make sure that that's going to work?
That works well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So, so that's working now. That's good. You can see the first screen. Yeah. So I thought I would build this around the Forest Wars book, but a significant part of it would be around climate action. Okay. So there's a new book, and it's made some people very grumpy, and but I think it's really important for a number of reasons to step through some of the things in this. Most importantly, this slide, I think, captures a lot of what's important here. So, you know, we've got the riders of the apocalypse, and now we've got a fifth rider called misinformation. And I think it's really crucial because the forest industry is actually a master of producing misinformation. And it just has never stopped. Even today, there was a member of the upper house in Victoria saying that I've subverted the peer review process. So I actually checked Google Scholar this morning, and we're sitting on about 96,500 publications or citations. So I don't know where that's coming from, but I just thought I'd put up there because it's a thing called evidence that's actually quite important in this space. And the Forest Wars book is built around evidence, scientific and economic. So my journey in this space actually started in this year, 1983. It was July 1983. And there's a photo of yours truly actually starting to do my first measurements in a forest. And I think it's really important to have some context here because 1983, there was no discussion of climate change. It just wasn't even thought of. The term biodiversity hadn't even been invented by E.O. Wilson at that stage. And the extent to which biodiversity was being lost wasn't even thought about. The concept of ecosystem services didn't come around till 1997. Land care wasn't born. Wildfires were always a surprise, always, every time. The words First Nations wasn't even thought of. And the idea of people working on country wasn't even contemplated. And I think it's crucial to understand that export wood chipping was in full swing. So here is an aerial photograph of Eden. And that is a logging coop, which is roughly 3 kilometres by 5 kilometres in size. And you can see the log landings. And the whole idea here was to convert this horrible, nasty forest with all these terrible big trees that had awful things in them like hollows and regrow the forest as beautiful, tall, straight saw logs. And the legacy of this we'll talk about later, but it's really quite profound to the extent it's probably going to take another 100 years to turn it back to what it was if we started a restoration process tomorrow. So that's 1983. Let's roll forward to 1997. And some people might recognize, I don't recognize the young man in this slide, but I recognize the older man, and that's Senator Robert Hill. And this is on a field trip, where we went to the forest, and I had Robert Hill's ear for 3 hours. And I've entitled this Brandolini's Law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle, because Robert Hill told me several times that the regional forest agreements were going to solve all the logging industry's problems. They were going to deliver certainty in timber, economic prosperity, conserve all the endangered species. That was Robert Hill himself. And I could have had this as myth number 1 in the book, but myth number 1 will come to later. And now, 2023, Robert Hill's actually signed a pledge to end native forest logging, which I think is pretty cool. Anyway, let's move to 1998. And I met my wife over a possum. And 2000, we've got a little possum and a greater glider as part of our ongoing work. And so then we moved forward to 2013. My son is 13 years old by this time. Julie Gillard is in office, and she's mulling over the fact that there's a demand for evidence-based policy, but somehow the government's stopped collecting evidence for evidence-based policy, and that's actually seriously what's happening in many cases. So let's roll forward now to 2024 and the misinformation process that we saw before. And it really is a significant problem. And so when the Teals were first elected, and I have to reinforce the opening comments that the Teals have been a breath of fresh air in Parliament. They really have. And so I was getting a lot of questions about forests from the various Teals. And I decided it was actually really important to write a book about some of the myths. And so the aim was to expose the myths using science and economics, including a lot of the work that we'd been doing in the last 30, 40 years. And then arm people with the ability to push back against the misinformation. And it was really catalysed by a Senate inquiry that I had to attend, Parliament House. And I heard the industry lobbyists wheel out every single myth. And I just thought, we have to do something about this, but create a new and better vision for the forests. So because this is a group that's interested about climate, I thought I'd start with the first myth. Excuse me. About how we need to log forests to save the climate. Now, I've heard this so many times that if you cut a forest down and then you use wood products to store carbon, and then the forest grows quickly, there'll be more carbon stored. And it's just wrong. It's a myth. So let's dismantle bits of the myth. So one of the key things is that most carbon in forests is stored in the really big trees. And you can see a mountain ash tree surrounded by the entire village of Pernshaw in the 1930s. The thing is, if you go to Tasmania today, you will see log trucks with a single tree on them. I saw it last week. And I think it's really interesting and really sad. This is from the 1950s in the journal Australian Forestry. And it says, why all this fuss about a tree on its way to the grinders of Australian newsprint mills? Thousands go down the same road every year so that we may, even in wartime, obtain our daily paper. So that tree is a day's paper pulp. And then it says at the end, indeed a giant of a vanishing generation. It's just extraordinary. Anyway, this is what a logging operation looks like. The vast majority of the biomass actually stays on the forest floor. And it gets volatilized, including the really big trees. So this was taken last week in the Harts Mountain. My wife took this photo on a tree that was too big to even fit on the back of a log truck. It's unbelievable that we would still be doing this in 2024. So a logging debris on a cut block or a logging coop is up to about 450 tonnes of biomass per hectare. And about half of that is volatilized after about a year of cutting. So you cut the forest, you let the logging slash dry, and then you burn it. And this photograph is not fog. It's not cloud. It's actually smoke. And there are vast regions in Tasmania and up until recently in Victoria where this was really common. And it was stated by government that these were all planned burns, hazard reduction burns. In fact, the vast majority of smoke was coming from regeneration burns after logging. So it's a major form of industrial pollution. But if we go back to the role of forests as carbon sinks, this is quite an old paper now. This dates from 2009. And one of the most important carbon sinks are really old growth forests. So this is a water catchment forest outside of Melbourne. It's about 90 minutes drive from the MCG. And someone's taken a photograph of me in a red jumper at the bottom of that forest. And when we actually measure the carbon, that means we don't model it, okay? You actually measure it. So you measure the heights of the trees, the diameters of the trees in the understory, the trees in the shrub layer. What we discover is that hectare of forest and many others like it in an old growth state, supporting up to 1,860 tonnes of above ground biomass per hectare. And they're still growing at about 1 metre per year. It's phenomenal. And they're growing they're growing quickly, but they're decaying slowly. And because they've got special leaves that hang vertically, that allows a lot of light to the understory layers, and you can see it in this photograph. So that allows a really dense 40, 50 metre tall understory with then a rainforest understory underneath that. So you've got wattles, rainforest trees, and then a whole series of layers, giving you these enormous carbon stocks. But what we see is that most of the carbon is actually tied up in the very large old trees. But the problem is the populations are declining very quickly in many of these areas. So large old trees are becoming very difficult to find. Not only have they been cut down, but when the rest of the landscape is cut, they become very, very susceptible to wind throw. And so we've done a lot of measurements of marked population of trees and how quickly they're falling over. And this is the actual data that we published just a few weeks ago, showing the rate of loss of hollow trees across a large number of sample sites. And we can use the repeated measurements to make projections of what's going on until trees get to about 120 years old, and then they first start to really develop some of the features of old growth. So we're going to see about a 95% decline in big trees across those ecosystems. But the other thing that's really important is that the large fallen trees are also really important carbon stock. They return a lot of carbon to the soil, but they're generally not included in any models of how much carbon is tied up in the forest. So our estimates are that we have about another 500 tonnes of carbon biomass that's tied up in the fallen trees that's generally not accounted for. So we've actually measured some of this. So it's really important to understand the carbon storage capacity of some of these forests. Australia has some of the most carbon dense forests anywhere in the world. Now, lots of people say, well, now we're getting lots of fires. We may as well cut the forest down because if it gets burnt, we'll lose all the carbon. Well, why don't we have a look? So let's look at what happened after the fires in 2009, because we had measured the vegetation on sites before the wildfires in that year and then measured it again after. And everything we do gets published. Okay, so that's really important to go through that process, despite what members of the upper house in the Victorian Parliament might say. So we see very large emissions from burning forests, but the stock loss is very important. So this is what people get confused about. The difference between a flow, which is the rate of accumulation of carbon, which tends to be very fast in young forests, and a stock, which is how much carbon is actually stored. And the most carbon is stored in the oldest forests. Now, when you have a fire, there's a lot of emissions, but the amount of stock loss is actually quite low. So under a low severity fire, we found that between 6 to 7% of the carbon stock was lost. Very high severity fires between 9 and 14%. But that forest, once it regenerates after fire, can replenish the carbon stock quite quickly. So the highest carbon stock resilience tends to be in the intact forests. That's actually really important to understand. That's why we need intact forests for storing carbon. So the reality is that logging generates a lot of carbon emissions. In Tasmania, native forest logging is the biggest emitting sector in the state's economy, and native forest logging in that state generates emissions equivalent to about 1.1 million cars. In Victoria, it was at the time that the industry was supposedly going to be closed, 1st of January, it's about 730,000 cars emissions per year. So if we stop native forest logging and land clearing in Australia, we'd easily meet our 2030 targets, easily. And we'd still have some change left over. And that's partly to do with the fact that Australia's native forests are the most carbon dense forests on Earth. So the most carbon dense forests on Earth are in Victoria at 1,860 tonnes. And then the next ones are in Tasmania at about 1,300 tonnes. Okay. So some people say, well, if we log the forests and then turn them into wood products and then regrow the forest, then we'll store more carbon. Okay. Yeah, okay, but it depends on what you're using your native forest for. And the important thing to understand here is that when we log native forests in Australia, only about 4% of the log forest actually goes into timber products. And so we've done the breakdown here. And sorry if it's a bit of a complicated diagram, but if you start at the top, okay, so you start with 100% biomass, okay, and then about 60% of a forest actually sits on the forest floor as debris, like you saw in the previous slide, and about half of that ends up as smoke pollution, and the other half, that 30% goes into what's called accelerated decomposition on the forest floor, and you'll see that in the next slide. Okay, so that means that 40% of the biomass is taken out as logs, right? Of that, 29% goes into the pulp stream to make paper, box liners, and packaging. About 9% of that is waste during manufacturing, which leaves you 20% of the original biomass goes into making paper. Okay, so of your 40% that comes out as logs, 11% goes into the timber stream, right? During that process, about 7% is waste. So that's sawdust, offcuts. You know, the sawdust often goes to be on the bottom of chicken pens. So that means that 4% goes into sawn timber products. Of that, 2% is beer pallets, and about 2% is fine quality sawn wood. So this is for forests in Tasmania and Victoria and in southern New South Wales. So that's your carbon breakdown. And that's why leaving forests intact ends up with much higher levels of carbon storage than if you log them. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through some other myths because I think it's important to understand what's really going on. And when I was an undergrad doing forestry units, we were told that there was no really serious effects of logging on biodiversity. Forest just grew back, and only a little bit of the forest was logged, so it didn't really matter, and everything was fine. Okay, so what we now know is that the effects of logging forests are instant. So most animals actually die on site, particularly mammals. Then the impact of logging a forest, like in the previous slide, you see that that area, the impact there is going to last for about 170 years because that's about how long it takes to grow the next crop of really big trees. Okay, so this is actually not even a clear fell. This is what's called variable retention harvesting. You can see all the trees on the hilltop here that have been retained. I'm quite serious. That's a variable retention harvesting system. The other thing is that logging is occurring in some of the most high conservation value forests. So we can work that out by looking at what's called species distribution models for threatened species and see how that overlaps with logging. And it turns out that logging is now occurring in the most high conservation value forests across Australia. So that's New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia. There are no data for Queensland, so we don't know. But the other thing that's really important is that there's cumulative impacts. Okay, so when you log a forest, you get this. Okay, so the white areas with the little stars in them, this is quite typical of a logging coop that was logged in a particular year, and then there's another coop and another one and another one and another one. So what's actually happening is that the landscape is having lots of pieces cut out of it, and that leads to what we call a cumulative effect. And over here, we have one of our long-term research sites, which has remained intact across the landscape, but the rest of the landscape's been changed. And what we see is that the more of these logging coops that are in the landscape, the fewer of some of the important species that we see. So this little summary is for some of the different species. So here's Leadbeater's possum. It's declined by about 50% on its sites over the last 25 years. And the more that forest is logged in the landscape, the less likely we are to get that animal on the site. And we see similar effects for other beasties too, like, like the mountain brush-tailed possum and the greater glider. And the species that bucks the trend is actually the sugar glider or Krebs glider, which actually likes disturbed forests and increases. So we can see that there's this really quite strong cumulative effect on many of these species, the more the forest is logged. Now, the other myth that gets promulgated regularly is that if we log forests, we'll make them less fire prone. But what does the data show? The data shows that clearly climate is a big driver of fire behavior. No doubt about that. But we also see that forests become more flammable the more we log them. And in some cases, they become more flammable the more hazard reduction burning we do, which is not something that people necessarily want to hear. So here's a little bit of data. So the red dots basically show forest fire danger index under extreme conditions in red. Moderate is orange, and low forest fire danger index is green. And we can see the general patterns comparing intact forest versus harvested forest or log forest in 3 different regions: Victoria, Southern New South Wales, and Northern New South Wales. And what we see is that a log forest always burns at higher severity than an intact forest, always. But the other thing that's really striking here is that the log forests burning under moderate fire weather are still burning at higher severity than the intact forest burning under extreme conditions. That is actually quite a profound outcome. So the reality is that, we're not doing well in the fire space. We're actually making our landscapes more flammable. And it's something that's actually a really major problem in an Australian context. What we see is that Australia is amongst those countries in the world where we see a very substantial increase in burning trend. Now, there's some other work we haven't published yet, but what it shows is that native forests that are logged actually burn much more frequently than our plantations, which is really quite stunning. That's one of the opposite trends to the rest of the world. So our native forests are burning so frequently now that it is actually impossible to get a sustainable sawlog industry based on native forests. Okay, so the fourth myth is that if we don't log our forests, we have to get timber from Borneo, and that's going to kill lots of orangutans. Okay, so this was a statement from the former minister, National Party Minister for Forests in the Victorian government. What's the reality? The reality is that almost all of our sawn timber already comes from plantations. Almost all of the native forest logging industry, the logs that it cuts goes into the wood chip, paper pulp, box liner production streams, nearly 90%. Our plantation eucalypt pulp logs that are being exported, 97%. So we're not even processing them in the country. And people that decide that they want a pizza from a well-known pizza chain, you can get mountain ash wood chips to smoke the pork bellies that go on those pizzas. I'm quite serious. Mountain ash, the world's tallest flowering plant, used to smoke the pork bellies that go on your pizzas. We don't import wood chips from Borneo. Most of the sawn timber is from plantations, and the timber imports for sawn wood come from New Zealand and Europe. And we're importing eucalypt pulp logs and wood chips from Vietnam. The industry structure is crazy. Okay, so these are not my numbers in many cases. They come from ABARES. All right. So the next myth is that logging is a really big contributor to the economy. Okay, really important to understand. So here we go. This is 10 years old. This is the business plan for Vic Forests. And what it says, this was a cabinet submission. Timber harvesting in its current form is not commercial. It actually costs you money to cut your forest down. Okay, go to Tasmania. Tasmania, the industry has cost that state somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 billion dollars. In New South Wales, Forestry Corporation got a handout of $249 million and still made a loss of $28 million. In Victoria, Vic Forest's last 2 years cost the state $269 million, and it still has a loan of $80 million, which you'll never be able to repay. The industry in Victoria has had an $875 million handout, and it's still not profitable. So I think it's really important for people to be aware of just how much the industry costs the taxpayer. But maybe the thing to do is to do environmental accounting. So we've done this for the Central Highlands area of Victoria. And we've looked at the contribution to regional GDP of the various natural resource sectors. And the biggest one is agriculture, because it produces wine and berries and other things for the Victorian market. Then the water supply, then tourism, then carbon at a shadow price of $12.23, then plantation timber, and then native forest timber at $12 million contribution to regional GDP. So the value of the water is 25.5 times the value of the timber. That's from environmental accounting. But it's not just us that's been looking at this. So Frontier Economics worked on this issue in southern New South Wales. Now, Frontier Economics is not just a cash for comments consulting company. They tell you what the result is, irrespective. And so what they're discovering is that in southern New South Wales, there's only about 8 sawmills and employs somewhere around about 280 people in direct and indirect jobs. The total industry without subsidies made a quote unquote profit of $400,000. In comparison, the plantation sector in the same region made a profit of $64 million. So there's a 400 times difference between the two. So the reality is that native forest logging is a major drain on the public purse. Doesn't matter whether you're in Tasmania, whether you're in New South Wales, whether you're in Victoria. It's the same story everywhere it's been looked at. And many, many different reports have shown that. So I think it's really important to think about where the most important return on investments are in this whole sector. And for native forests, it's producing water for cities like Sydney and Melbourne. It's storing large amounts of carbon to deal with climate change. And it's for tourism and for people working on country, and we'll come to that in a moment. And plantations are where we should be sourcing our wood products. And the carbon research shows that carbon emissions from plantations are much, much, much lower than they are from native forests. So when people ask me about the future of forestry, it's not in native forest logging, it's in plantations. And we need to focus foresters' efforts not only on plantation design, but on urban forests, farm forestry, mine site rehabilitation, those kinds of things. So when I start to think then about what do we need to do in forests, we have to have formal protection. And we've been thinking a lot about this for quite some time. So we've been pushing this notion of a Great Forest National Park. And we've started to be asked about some finance structures for the Great Koala National Park. And the problem is if you don't have formal protection, you get what's just happened in Tasmania. So Tasmania got a new government, it ripped up the old peace deal, and now it's going to open up 40,000 hectares of a wood bank. And so we've gone directly back to the forest wars that Julia Gillard and Tony Burke and others tried to win the peace. But if you have reserves, there's still a lot of work to do. A lot of these areas have been degraded by logging over a very long time. And so in the last 18 months, we've been looking at putting together a green bond for the Great Forest National Park. And now we're being asked to think about a green bond for the Great Koala National Park. And one of the important things is to start to design these kinds of green bonds with First Nations people for working on country, doing meaningful things. You know, here we have the Juri dancers doing a sorry dance on log country. You know, this is like killing their mother for them and their cultural connection to land. And there are some really good models, such as Buddery National Park, where we've worked for over 23 years now, of co-management between an agency and a First Nations group. So in the context of some of our forests, like for example, the tall wet forest in Victoria, done a lot of thinking about what's called the proceeds of the bond. Now, this is financial terminology that I've had to learn. We need to put up nest boxes and hollow hogs, artificial hollows, for those cavity-dependent animals that are declining very quickly. We've got a lot of forest restoration work to do, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We've got massive problems with feral deer, which is right across southeastern Australia, including in Tasmania. And we need to put in tourism infrastructure in the right ways to be able to bring people back into these forest environments. Because in many cases, they've been locked out. People have been locked out of forests by logging operations. It's really important to understand that. Now, a green bond is only going to work if it's monitored properly, and that return on investment from the proceeds of the bond is reported to every investor. Now, the important thing here is that you can invest in forest restoration, but you don't need carbon offsets. You don't need ACCUs. You know, the rapid transition out of native forest logging in Victoria and WA happened without offsets. It happened without ACCUs. It's happened without biodiversity certificates, all that sort of stuff. So here we have a really classic example of what we see in many of these forest environments now, is that there's post-logging failed regeneration. It characterises about 30% of wood production landscapes. And so there's a lot of trees to be put back in the landscape. But to put the trees back, you've not only got to plant the trees, but you've also got to shoot a lot of deer, because there's big issues with deer browsing that has a big effect on young vegetation. But therein lies an opportunity for an industry. A sambar deer, you know, a dressed carcass for a sambar deer is about $1,000. Remembering that sambar deer is a ruminant, and there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them, producing lots of emissions. And then we've got beasties like this one, the greater glider, that is in serious trouble. It's declining just about everywhere that people are looking at it. You know, we've had extinctions of this animal, regional extinctions in some of our long-term work. And so we've had to do a lot of work to design the next generation of nest boxes and artificial hollows for these beasties. So here's a really good example of having a nest box tested in a temperature controlled facility, working out how to ensure that we don't bait these animals during the day, and also provide suitable conditions for them so that they can weather the problems of high overnight temperatures, because these animals are very marginal energetically and they can't deal with high overnight temperatures. So there's some of the activities that are associated with putting the forest back together. I'm going to leave it there. Sorry that my voice has been giving out, but I'm happy to go back to taking questions.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Wow, that's pretty shocking, a lot of that information, actually. The one that, I mean, just when you put that sort of chart up that showed the percentage that went into the actual products at the end, it was the amount of waste in there was incredible.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And it's increasing because as time's gone on, the industry is cutting into more and more marginal country.
Yeah.
on steeper and steeper slopes that are often more and more remote from areas. So that means that it's lower productivity forest. So you've got lower levels of sawlog return, high levels of pulp logs, more logging slash, and more marginal. So that the costs of the industry are going up as the quality of the resource is going down. And so you see in a state like Tasmania, Tasmania's added 80,000 people to its population in the last 15 years. 50,000 people to the workforce, yet the number of people employed in the native forest logging industry has halved in that time. And so 75% of the industry in Tasmania, which is the main area for all native forest logging in Australia now, 75% of the industry is actually in plantations. And 99.4% of the workforce in Tasmania is not in the native forest logging industry. So the total number of employees working in direct jobs in the native forest logging industry in Tasmania is 290.
Right.
Wow.
And the total number of forest industry employees, plantation and native forests, direct jobs is 885.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so why, I mean, it looks like everywhere it's loss making. Why do state governments continue to subsidize it?
Because you've got two very effective lobby groups on either side of politics. So you've got the CFMEU, the F part of the CFMEU is very powerful, and it's the biggest donor to the ALP.
Yeah.
And it's very strongly connected to the right side of the ALP. And then you've got AFPA, so the Australian Forest Products Association, and it changes its CEO depending on who's in power. So its previous CEO was a guy called Ross Hampton, who used to work for Peter Reith of Children Overboard fame or infamy. And he was CEO, so he had a very large amount of sway over the coalition. And then one of the new senior people in AFPA is a guy called Joel Fitzgibbon, who was a senior frontbencher for the ALP. Okay, so
Not my
result,
his environmental stance.
yeah, so the result here is that the industry is always in a position with its hand out. And the problem here is that if we were to stop native forest logging, not only would we reach our carbon emissions targets fairly quickly, we would also be in a position where we would stimulate significant investment in the plantation sector, including processing plantation eucalypt pulp logs in the country for Australian jobs. So it's the policy framing here is nuts in terms of the amount of money that the different states are hemorrhaging for propping up an industry that employs so few people.
And in terms of, am I right in saying that in Victoria and Western Australia, they banned native logging? Is that correct? But it's still
yeah, yes and no. So what you do when you say that you're going to exit is you call it something else, right? So in Western Australia, the concern is that there's too many trees in the landscape, right? So we stop native forest logging, but gosh, there are so many trees, we need to thin the forest. So we might thin it down to maybe 6 to 10 trees, 12 trees per hectare. Okay. And oh gosh, isn't that amazing? We've got all these trees left over that are on the ground. We may as well do something with them. Why don't we take them to a sawmill or a firewood yard or that kind of stuff? Okay, so it's just logging by another name. And the same thing is happening in Victoria. So Victoria is closing its organisation, Big Forests, but at the same time, it's putting in huge fire breaks, about 5,000 hectares worth. So the logs from those fire breaks have been cut in national parks and then taken for commercial outcomes. Then there's salvage logging post fire and post windstorm, And then there's logging, private land logging, where it looks as though it's been alleged that the money that was given to a sawmill to exit the industry was then used to buy private land to keep logging.
Hmm.
And then there's logging by First Nations people. But it's not called logging, it's called forest gardening.
Right.
Yeah.
So is that then it's a state, the decisions are based at a state level rather than a federal level, is that right? Or is there any impact from a federal perspective here?
There's very little impact from the federal perspective because the RFAs override the EPBC Act.
Right. So then when you're speaking to people in the different states, what sort of, there seems to be an awareness of what sort of action is happening, do you think?
Well, at the moment, it's a complicated space because people are talking about carbon credit, ACCUs, all of those kinds of things, peace deals and stuff like that. Frankly, after having been in Tasmania last week and then revisiting all the numbers, my personal opinion is we'd all be better off, including the workers, if you were to make a rapid exit from industry.
Yeah.
290 workers, direct jobs.
Yeah.
You could afford to pay every worker $500,000, maybe more.
Yeah.
And the industry would be done and dusted, and there would be certainty. So on the mainland, because of the relationship between fire and logging, the reality is that the chances of being able to grow saw logs is vanishingly small, and there is no certainty in the industry. The chances of growing a tree for 100, 120 years, or even 80 years, you've got an 80% chance that the forest will burn before it gets to 80 years. Okay. So the chances of growing a saw log are minimal. So that means that people don't want to invest in the native forest industry because it has no social license to operate, and it has no certainty of saw logs, including in New South Wales. And the only way that the industry can operate in Tasmania is to open up the so-called wood bank, which is just going to open up the forest wars again. And in fact, the industry didn't want that because it's starting all the conflict all over again. And that just delivers a huge hammer for Bob Brown to beat the industry over the head with. The reality is the industry would be better off to be out of native forest logging, to take the exit packages. In Victoria, almost all the timber workers that left have got jobs straight away because they've got the kind of skills that you can use in the plantation sector. And the kind of equipment.
So do you think that will happen?
I think ideologically in Tasmania, I think it's very hard at this stage because Tasmania has used the industry as a way to essentially blackmail money out of the federal government. And I think the conservation movement was naive by negotiating a peace deal, not understanding that an incoming government would just tear it up. So my firm conclusion from all this is that you have to have areas properly protected. They have to be protected as national parks. It doesn't mean that you walk away. You actually got to manage them. The legacy of logging is often failed regeneration, weed problems, feral animal problems, be it deer, be it sugar gliders in Tasmania, all kinds of things. So you still need people working in the forest, just not cutting down trees.
Now, very conscious of your voice not giving out on this, David, so I'm going to fire a few questions at you because we've got lots coming in on the chat here.
I've got my soothers going, so I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay. So Matt, sort of a good one here, just what you're talking about actually. So 30% of regeneration failing is alarming, obviously. What happens next and who's responsible?
Okay, so we haven't published that work yet. It's actually sitting with my co-author. We see that areas on steep slopes, areas at the margins of what we call a bioclimatic envelope of some of these tree species are very susceptible to regeneration failure. So it costs about $5,000 to $6,000 per hectare to regenerate some of these tall, wet forests. You've actually got to do some bulldozer work to re-expose the soil, and then you've got to do a reburn, and then you have to seed it from the air. So it's quite a process, but there are people that are able to do that. At the same time, you've got to do an enormous amount of deer control. And so you've got to, there are ways to do this tactically, where you might regenerate 1,000 to 2,000 hectares of forest per year in an integrated way with a lot of deer control, essentially using sensible, what's called silvicultural tactics to bring the forest back. So the average wood production forest block has about 30% of its area that should have trees on it that don't. So that's snig tracks, log landings, roads, and other areas with compacted soils, and places where there wasn't sufficient seed that was put on the ground after the logging operation to bring the trees back.
Okay. Thanks for that. Donna Layer asks, given so much is exported, is this a result of free trade agreements? And if so, how can these be challenged?
I'm not sure of the mechanism why it's ended up like this. What I have written about is the need to have a wood reserve, like Western Australia has a gas reserve. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a proponent of gas, but Western Australia did hold back part of its LNG exports to use for domestic purposes. Essentially, what we're doing in Australia is simply exporting our eucalypt pulp logs and then often buying it back again after it's processed. So really, what needs to happen here is that government can step in, create a wood reserve, and you would think that the CFMEU might actually be interested in that, because that's its workers that are going to be grinding up trees to put into making paper and other products. The critical thing here is that plantation eucalypt trees are actually better pulp, have a higher return of pulp per paper pulp per unit log volume than native forests do, and they produce better paper with longer fibers. So that's been known since 2011. So there's a big opportunity here to have Australian workers processing Australian trees in Australia for Australian jobs. That sounds like the sort of thing that even Anthony Albanese could say in a sentence.
Yeah. And Catherine asks, so what can we do individually to help resolve some of the more significant issues? Any suggestions for our group?
Well, I think there are. I think there's lots of things that can be done. Like the fact that you were there for that NCC meeting, supporting some of these fantastic teals. I think writing to politicians, being active in this space, continuing to push the agenda about why it's so important to make sure that we're not logging native forests as part of the climate change solution. Like seriously, we do not need to be building new nuclear power plants. We can meet our carbon emissions reduction target. Nobody is talking about that. We're trying to get an op-ed up about it pretty soon, but we can meet those targets with some pretty simple and straightforward things that would actually be really positive for the economy, because we wouldn't be shelling out tens of millions of dollars every year to an industry that generates, millions of cars worth of emissions every year.
Yeah. What did you think when you heard what Peter Dutton said recently?
I think it's delusional, because where are we going to put these? So are we going to have the first place they're going to say, I know, will be Jervis Bay. It'll be Buddery National Park, because it's Commonwealth land, and they won't think about the fact that it takes 8 days for the water to go into the bay and back out again. The only thing that will happen there is it'll glow bright green at night. That it's wrong to say that we can't meet our emissions targets when we do some fairly simple things like what I've been talking about tonight. And some of the other things that haven't been mentioned is not only is nuclear power so ridiculously expensive and so far off, you know, it'll be 2050 I'll be 90 by the time they got that sorted out. But the other thing that isn't being discussed at the moment is that when you look at what's happening in Russia and in the Ukraine, there's an enormous targeting of nuclear power plants because there's such a terrorist liability. And you've only got to fail in the security once and someone messes with a nuclear power plant. You don't need to drop a nuclear bomb on someone if you mess with someone's nuclear power plant. It's just a liability that we don't need. I can't believe that a opposition leader that's so focused on security is contemplating something which is such a liability.
Yeah. Well, the other interesting thing that came out of the breakfast last week was just it doesn't make any economic sense, on any front. And it's interesting. We've got Tim Buckley coming to join us next month, and he's very vocal on that at the moment as well.
Yeah, it's some multiple number of times that the cost of solar and wind energy. It's crazy. What we do have to watch for is biomass. There's a lot of discussion about burning trees in coal-fired power stations. That's crazy. 1 ton of trees is equivalent to about 1 ton of carbon emissions. So Julie's got some good points about other ways that people can and should engage in this space. I think politicians only respond when people push them. They don't lead, they follow.
Yeah, some good points there. Very good. All right. Well, I think I'm just looking at some of the other questions here. Any thoughts on some of these other? What about this question here? Can you see the one from Scott there, David? It's quite long.
No, I can't. If you read out.
He says, deforestation, like any industry, is driven by product. It appears from your numbers it is extremely inefficient process to produce product. That's what we're talking about, just the efficiency of it. You mentioned plantation forests are the answer. Does this solve the product demand globally, as this issue is not just for Australia, but a global problem? I mean, do you want to just talk a little bit more about what's happening globally in this regard?
Yeah, so it's pretty clear that there's a big shift globally to plantations because they're so much more efficient at producing wood fiber.
Yeah.
It doesn't work everywhere, plantation space. It is context specific. In an Australian context, because our native forests are burning so much more than our plantations, it makes no sense to make our native forests more and more and more flammable. We get 9 crops from a plantation in a 75-year period, as opposed to 1 crop of saw logs from a native forest in 80 years. Okay, so when you log a native, when you establish a plantation, you thin it after 15 years, you thin it after 20 years, you clear fell it at 25, you replant it, so you get 9 crops in 75 years, right? That includes newsprint, it includes fence strainers, it includes floorboards, roof trusses, furniture. Native forest, by and large, needs to grow for about 80 years to give you a single saw log crop. So there's no comparison, even in jobs. So on a per hectare basis, the number of jobs in plantations is about 3 times on a per hectare basis the number of jobs in the native forest sector. And the FTE required capital investment is about 10 times for the native forest sector as opposed to the plantation sector. So nothing about it makes any sense anymore to keep logging native forests. Globally, an increasing proportion of our wood supply, around about 30% globally, comes from plantations, from a fraction of the area. So what's really needed, I think, is some proper policy in this space to sort out. This to me, this is it's a fraud on the public in terms of how much money is being invested for how few jobs and how little return. It's costing the taxpayer to do this. And that means that it's stealing money from other sectors, doctors, nurses, school teachers, aged care facilities, other kinds of things. and you can't justify that in a cost of living crisis. It's just totally inappropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was amazing, David. Thank you so much. I've learned so much tonight. That was quite shocking, and yeah, pretty sad, but also very, very informative. I just want to draw everyone's attention. There's lots of great ideas in the chat of what you can do. Julie Taylor Mills has put some ideas up, but getting active, writing letters to politicians, supporting campaigns that are trying to act against native logging, and yeah, supporting Teals, and I suppose trying to really bring the truth out, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Well, David, I committed to the 1 hour and you were bang on. So thank you so much that you've really done. That's been a fabulous session. It really has, really informative, and lots for us all to learn and take away. And I think lots of potential for action there as well. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's really, really appreciated. And thank you so much. It's been fabulous. To everyone, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's session and feel that you've learned a lot from David's fantastic presentation and the questions that followed. And you know more about our precious forests and maybe what we can all do to support David and all the other great work that's going on around the place as well. Going forward, we've got a fantastic lineup of sessions over the coming months. So next month, July, we've got Tim Buckley, who's the Director of the Climate Energy Finance. Tim is a member of our group, and he'll chat about the recent budget and what it had in it for the environment and what it lacked for biodiversity. Interestingly, he's also in China currently, so we may ask him to talk a little bit about what he's seeing over there. And also, he's very vocal around the recent announcements by Peter Dutton, so we'll probably get him chatting about that as well, the 2030 targets and nuclear power. And then we're also in August, we're planning on doing a session around climate and health, and we've got a number of really good speakers lined up for that as well. So hope you can join us for those sessions. In the next couple of days, we'll be sending around a questionnaire which we've put together just to get your feedback. We're really keen to get that feedback so that we can keep building our group here for all of you and making sure it's giving you what you're looking for. So this will come around to you, and we appreciate your comments on that. And as always, thanks again for making the time on a Monday evening and to join us. And please do keep spreading the word, because our group continues to grow and it's fabulous to see. And so please keep spreading the word within your networks. Thanks, everyone, and